Hi, Brooke and Chelsea. Laura here. This is a screencast presentation that's meant to build on your readings for the week and also to build on some of what you saw and some of the principles that were discussed in the two videos that I posted for our online class this week. In particular, what I'd like to do is help you differentiate between phonics spelling and word study instruction, as well as vocabulary instruction, I guess, and then also to talk about some key principles for skills instruction that I'm hoping you guys can be building into your lesson plans as you continue that process in your clinical placements. So let's start with distinguishing between phonics instruction and spelling instruction. Many people view these as the same thing, and they are strongly related, but they are not exactly the same thing. So we'll start with phonics instruction, which you can see on the left-hand side. So as you know, phonics refers to letter-sound correspondences. This is the basic connection between phonemic awareness, or the awareness of the sounds that our language makes, and the alphabetic principle, the idea that sounds are represented by different letters of the alphabet, as well as combinations of those letters. So phonics instruction then teaches young readers and writers about this idea that letters, or which are also known formally as graphemes, and sounds or phonemes are related. So this is the idea that letter sound relationships are often patterned. So, for example, a common letter sound pattern that very young children will be taught is the consonant vowel consonant pattern, like pat or mat, or let's see, lob. Those are all consonant vowel consonant words. So phonics instruction is going to focus on these things, the relationships between different graphemes and phonemes, as well as specific patterns that are often found in our language. Now, spelling is very much related to this, but if you look on the right-hand side of the screen, spelling refers to the specific ways in which sounds are represented in print. So not the idea that sounds are represented in print and what really matching specific letters and sounds, but really more focusing in terms of instruction with young readers and writers on specific patterns of spelling. So whereas phonics instruction might focus on consonant, vowel, consonant, spelling instruction is going to focus on things such as onset and rhyme. So specific word families, like if you had different onsets like M and B and C. So M, K, and B. I think those are the three I said. And then you had a rhyme, R-I-M-E, like at. You could have mat, bat, and cat, right? So those are all consonant, vowel, consonant words, but the focus in spelling instruction is more on specific patterns, such as onset and rhyme. Also specific rules of spelling, such as the silent E and how it impacts the sound that a vowel makes, such as back versus bake. Fine differences, but definite differences between spelling and phonics. So phonics is not just spelling instruction. It's a concept, the idea that letters and sounds are related. So phonics instruction is meant to teach relationships ranging from specific letter sounds and how they're similar. So for example, the B grapheme, the letter B, is a representation of the sound B. As well as how specific sounds can be represented in different ways. So the phoneme F can be represented by a PH, an F, or a GH. And then it's also addressing how sounds that are made by specific consonant and vowel diagraphs. So you can see like CL and TR, so cl and tr, as well as vowel diagraphs like ow and oo. So I see a typo here. It's not the same as spelling, but it's strongly related, and phonics instruction is going to support spelling. So spelling instruction is again going to focus more on patterns of letter arrangements. So again, onsets and rhymes, as well as different how different consonant digraphs can impact vowel sounds. So, for example, the CK, in phonics instruction, you would just teach that that makes a k sound, right? But in spelling instruction, you're going to be teaching about how that digraph CK is going to impact the vowel sound. There are exceptions, but it's going to impact the vowel sound and make the A have a short sound. So it's not rake it, it's racket, right? It's not steak or stock, it's stack and back. And then same with the O, it's lock, flock, clock, and rocket. So again, phonics is going to focus on what those specific digraphs or graphemes represent, and spelling is going to look more at the patterns of how relationships between letters and sounds operate within words. So now that we've established some similarities and differences between phonics and spelling, I really want to bring to your attention the notion of word study, because word study is something that also gets mixed up oftentimes with both spelling instruction and with vocabulary instruction. So I'm going to be moving left to right. Actually, no, I'm not. I'm going to be first talking about spelling instruction on the left-hand side of your screen, then vocabulary instruction, which we read about, oh gosh, was it 1 or 2 weeks ago now? And then I'm going to be talking about how word study is sort of a blend of these things. So just as I said before, spelling instruction focuses on specific words and spelling patterns. It doesn't focus on learning new words and the meanings of words. Unfortunately, in schools, you often find spelling instruction to essentially be a focus on words in isolations, like lists of words, and weekly cycles of practice and spelling tests. And sometimes these cycles are going to include, saying or writing a word in a sentence. But there's a lot of research that shows that these kinds of cycles of isolated spelling instruction are really not all that effective. And I'll talk later in this presentation about how spelling instruction as well as other skills should be meaningful and contextualized, but I'll leave that for now. So let's jump over to the right-hand side where it says vocabulary instruction. Vocabulary instruction is really going to focus on learning new words. It actually does not focus on spelling at all. The whole focus are the concepts or ideas or meanings conveyed by words. So typical ways of thinking about which vocabulary words to teach will focus on tier 1, tier 2, or tier 3 words. So tier 2 words tend to be the primary focus of vocabulary instruction. So tier 1 words, we don't really need to focus on these words and what they mean because they're pretty common in everyday vocabulary. Now kids may need to know how to spell them, but that's a different thing, right? So tier 1 words, which are high frequency everyday words, are going to include things like school, lunch, mother, family, stuff like that. Laugh, smile. Big, large, small, words like that. Tier 2 words are less frequent. And they also tend to be a little bit more complex, and they will occur across contexts. So a word like mountainous might appear in a novel, but it may also appear in a geography lesson, right, or textbook, or a history textbook. A word like complex is a word that you can encounter in many different content areas and contexts. Squirt, smashed, sparkly, frond, let's see, arbor. These are all words that are more complex. They don't tend to be as frequently used, and kids don't encounter them as frequently in texts when they're beginning readers in particular. But they are a lot more frequent and will occur across more contexts than tier 3 words. Tier 3 words are highly contextualized. So these are things like hypotenuse, which is really you're only going to hear in the context of math, right? Crystallization, hypothesis, Let's see, in terms of what's one and we might find in English, like juxtaposition and metaphorical, right? These words are not quite as common and they tend to be more, not exclusively so, but used primarily within particular content areas or domains. So we tend to teach those more in the content areas. So in language arts, tier two words really tend to be the primary focus of vocabulary instruction. And what you're going to see are things like concept maps where you're comparing the meaning of one word to the meaning of another and how well you know words, right? Um, and you may get kids to do visual representations of words to convey the different meanings, or even how certain words carry different meanings in different contexts. So that's really the focus of vocabulary instruction. There's no focus on spelling. Now, the really cool thing about word study is that it really blends spelling and vocabulary together. um, Word study is really an instructional routine, and it brings together vocabulary and spelling in ways that tend to be really engaging for kids and also really, really useful when we're trying to teach kids both meaning making and how print is supposed to make sense, but also how to spell and identify words more independently. Rather than constantly having to look up at a word wall or constantly having to ask somebody else. So, and this is helpful too because the longer words and are like tier two words are less likely for particularly for beginning readers, they're less likely to just be able to recognize them automatically. So the whole idea with word study is that it focuses on the relationships between words and concepts, as well as on morphology. So you're really looking at, so within words, if we want to focus on morphology, so we're looking at relationships between different parts of one word, right? So we're looking at roots and stems, and then prefixes and suffixes. So if you look at the word construct, right? Struct is the root of the word. And it's also the same root that you find in instruction and structure and destruct and whatnot. And so we look at the meaning of the root or the stem, and then we also look at the prefixes and suffixes and what those mean. So the idea here is we're looking at how morphological aspects of words relate to spelling patterns. So the idea here is that if you know how to spell the word nation, and you also know the word formality, then you can also spell nationality. And you could also sort of examine that suffix of ity, and sort of examine what it means, right? And what it does to the root of the word. There are other examples of this that can get into areas of critical literacy and really interesting conversations. So, for example, what does the word ism, or I'm sorry, what does the suffix ism do to a word, right? So we'll have the word race. And then if you add the word racism, that not only changes the meaning of the word, but it really changes the effect that that word is going to have on people, right? Same thing with sex and sexism, right? So, really interesting conversations can be had in the context of word study. So, within word study, you are, oh, by the way, you're also looking at different forms of a word. So, for example, you could look at the word nation, and then you could look at the word nationality, nationalism, um, national, and keep going, right? So you can look at different forms of words, and then you can also look at synonyms, antonyms, homonyms, and homophones. So the idea here is as we do word study with kids, it may be a 20-minute period of time during your day. Um, it can also be a center in different, in early childhood classrooms. It can be a part of Daily Five. Word study can be done in whole class lessons as well, just like you saw in the one of the videos. Um, but the idea with word study is that you are not only expanding students' vocabulary by teaching them word meanings, you're sort of teaching them, you're giving them strategies or understandings about words that's going to help them build their own vocabularies and begin recognizing and being able to write a whole slew of other words, as well as to spell them. Um, the one thing about the first video you guys watched is it's a spelling lesson, and you're looking at all of these what different suffixes, for example, or sorry, what different suffixes will do to the spelling of the word. That's a spelling lesson more than a word. Well, some people will call it word study. In classic word study, you're also exploring what those words mean, not just the spelling patterns and the rules. So ideally, if I were going to change that lesson you saw in the first video to make it more word study-ish, um, I would probably do a smaller number of words, and then we would really be um, talking about the meanings of those words, and we would be engaging with those words in authentic text. So we might be reading a book in which those words were there, and we would be talking about the story and or the meaning of the text if it's nonfiction, and those concepts, as well as talking about spelling patterns. So that's sort of how word study relates to spelling and vocabulary instruction. So I guess in a nutshell, what I like to see in classrooms is, rather than a specific, I like to see vocabulary instruction. Um, and I like to see spelling instruction, but I really like to see those things blended together in an instructional routine called word study, rather than having spelling just be a time of the day. Oh, now we're doing spelling, right? I like to tell children, now we're doing word study, and here's what we're going to be doing today, right? Sometimes that's going to have a vocabulary focus, sometimes it's going to have a spelling focus with those same vocabulary words. But you're looking at words in context, you're dissecting words, and you're learning about words. So that's that in a nutshell. Um, let's talk a little bit now about key principles of skills instruction. And right now I'm focusing on not just word study, phonics, and spelling, but also fluency, which you'll be reading about, comprehension instruction, and vocabulary, which you've already read about. Um, so these are 5 principles that I really want to hit home to you. These are principles that, um, based on conferencing with you guys and reading over your lesson plans, I really want you guys thinking about. So first, I really want you thinking about making your lesson plans meaningful. So your instruction must connect to using print to make meaning, right? So in an interactive read aloud, or in guided reading, that's pretty much built into the structure. You have a real live text that you're going to be reading, right? Um, but sometimes you see sort of isolated skill drill lessons focusing on spelling or what have you, that where the words really or concepts really aren't embedded in a meaningful text, or where there's really no connection made to why you need to learn this particular skill. Like, in other words, you want to emphasize how your instruction relates to real texts. And meaning making. This relates to the second principle, which is that your instruction should be contextualized, which means it should always be applied or contextualized within real reading, writing, and language experiences. So, if you're talking about, oh gosh, punctuation or something like that, and you're teaching punctuation, you really ought to be doing that in the context of real writing. So teachers would be modeling that with a real piece of writing and thinking aloud about why they would insert different kinds of punctuation in different places, and what effect that has on the reader and how it benefits the reader. And then kids should get a chance to practice that with real writing. That's in contrast to worksheets. Worksheets where kids just have sort of random sentences that they would need to add punctuation into are really unhelpful because they don't help kids connect to real writing for real purposes. Um, and what you often find are kids who might be able to do it on a worksheet, but then they can't transfer that to to actually making that skill function within real activity in the world. So I really recommend steering clear of skills worksheets like that. Even as an intermediary between a write aloud where the teacher's modeling a skill and then kids going off and doing an activity and then being able to do something on their own, rather than having kids sit individually at their desks to practice the skill with a worksheet, makes a lot more sense to maybe after you do an interactive read aloud, or sorry, interactive write aloud, where maybe you're modeling when you would put an exclamation point and when you might use, and how that's different from using a period. I would then have kids grouped together to share little bits of their writing, or even give them maybe a copy of their guided reading book, and you could put them in those groups, and but take out the punctuation. And so it's a text they've seen before, it's familiar to them, and now they need to work together to figure out, now gosh, where would the punctuation go? So that's another approach, that you could have kids working in groups. That's way more meaningful than doing individualized worksheets. So contextualized instruction like that really makes a lot more sense in worksheets. In terms of your lesson planning, I really want to see your lesson plan instructional purpose and objectives really be focused and not vague. So an example of a vague instructional purpose would be that you want that the purpose of this lesson will be to teach students to comprehend while reading independently. That doesn't really that tells me as a professor, or it might tell your principal or a substitute teacher, the general area that you're focusing on, comprehension, but it doesn't say anything about what you're going to be teaching kids to do, right? So one example of something that would be more specific would be, the purpose of this lesson is to teach students how to draw connections between um, characters in a story they're familiar with to characters in a new book, right? So, or maybe draw connections from one text to another, or connections across fairy tales. Another one might be that you're trying to teach students to identify the main idea or main point of an informational piece of writing or a piece of persuasive writing. That's a lot more specific, and it gives you something that is teachable. So focus is really important. The fourth key principle I want you to be considering as you continue your planning is that all high quality instruction is supported. And what I mean by this is that your instruction, what you're asking kids to do, it needs to be supported with modeling, okay? I can't say model enough. Model, 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 and when in doubt, model some more. So if you are not modeling, if you're simply saying, we're going to be doing this, go and you explain it, and then you ask them to go ahead and do it or perform the task, you're basically assigning something and then assessing that thing, but you're never teaching them how to do it. And that's not really fair. You can't really assign somebody something and then assess it later, but never teach them actually how to do it. So the absolute most important part of teaching is the modeling. It's the demonstration. It's letting the kids get inside your head. So when you're teaching a skill such as such as teaching onset and rhyme, you may be doing a read aloud. And then you're going to think out loud. You're going to say, gosh, you know what I noticed about this text? I noticed that all of these words rhyme. They sound alike. Listen to this. And then you can pull those words out of the book, right? And then you can show them, underline the onset, underline the rhyme. You can even color code it, right? And then you can send them off in groups or partners with a new text or their guided reading book or their literature circle book or what have you to see if they can identify some onsets and rhymes and color code them. And then after that, as they are engaged in independent reading and writing, then you're really going to be looking for, is this something that they can do on their own? Okay. So, but you've really got to be supporting what you're teaching. Finally, coherent. And by coherent, what I mean is that your instructional purpose and objectives, your listed standards, and your procedures, including modeling, as well as your assessment, all need to be consistent with one another. Okay? So, what we're going to do is we're going to actually look at actually, sorry, let me just back up for a second. All of those principles, I think I already said this, but they apply to all of these areas of skills instruction. This doesn't just apply to spelling and phonics and word study. So all of these areas, that's sort of a general principle. And that's also tied to the gradual release of responsibility that I introduced you to when I was introducing you to a workshop model. Okay. So what I'm going to do is actually I'm going to go out of this PowerPoint for a minute and I'm going to be walking through a lesson plan for you using the book Mouse Mess by Linnea Riley. So let me escape out of PowerPoint for a second. And I am going to go to Chrome. And the first thing I want to do is introduce you to this book in case you're not familiar with the book Mouse Mess. But I've crafted a lesson plan for this text, and so I'll play this video for you, and it's basically a read aloud online, which is kind of cute.
My name is Will Edwards, and I'm a pediatrician, and that's a doctor for kids. And I am going to read today Mouse Mess by Linnea Riley. Hush, hush, little mouse is sound asleep inside his house. On the stairs, sounds of feet. Mouse is up. It's time to eat. Crunch, crunch, crunch. He wants a cracker. Munch, munch, munch. A cookie snacker. Crackle sweet. He rakes cornflakes. Whee! And jumps into the pile he makes. Sniff, sniff. Milk and cheese. Mouse would like a taste of these. Splish, splash. The milk spills out. Food is scattered all about. Sticky, gooey jam to spread with peanut butter smeared on bread. Tipping, slipping, sugar falls. Pour and pat make castle walls. Olives, pickles, ketchup, fun. Boop, pop the tops off, one boop, by one. Mouse steps back. He looks around. He can't believe the mess he's found. Who made this awful mess? Asked Mouse. These people need to clean this house. Gurgle bubble. Water flows. Soaks the jam between his toes. Ah. Now that Mouse is clean and fed, he leaves the mess and goes to bed.
All right, I hope you enjoyed that book. What I want to do now is I want to show you the lesson plan that I created for teaching rhyming and spelling with Mouse Mess. So this lesson, you can kind of read through it as I scroll slowly. and I'm also going to share this on the wiki for you, but this lesson is designed to help students identify rhyming words that make up different word families. This is a lesson I designed for grade levels, maybe 1 and 2. Yeah, I could do this with third grade, depending on the group. And it could also be an advanced lesson for some kindergartners who are already um, reading and really show that they have a pretty good understanding of some word families and are thinking in more complex ways about some spelling patterns and rhymes. So ultimately, my goal here is for students to use spelling patterns and rhyme to recognize words as they're reading and to use more conventional spelling when they're writing. The standards here, you can see I've got 3 reading foundational skills standards here. 2 of them are for 2nd grade, and one of them, oh wait, no, I think they're all 2nd grade, or maybe this one's 3rd grade. But the idea here is that I want my students to know spelling sound correspondences for additional common vowel teams. And I want them to be able to identify words with inconsistent but common spelling sound correspondences. And then I also want them to use context to confirm a self-correct word recognition and understanding. Rereading is necessary. So basically, here's the context. The context of this lesson is that we've already read several texts that include rhyme. This is not an introduction to the concept of rhyming words. And so this text builds on it, but it also includes some rhyming words that don't share the same spelling patterns. So students at the end of this lesson are going to be giving a rhyming text in partners, and they'll seek out additional rhyming pairs, as well as words that rhyme but are not spelled in the same way. And then at the end, we would then debrief, and we would add those words to an anchor chart. And then I would prompt students to use those anchor charts and supports as they write. So here are my materials. I talk about the theory here. I'm not going to talk about it right now, but you can read those over on your own as you're thinking about how theories might apply to your own instruction. We have talked about academic language before. I'm not really going to be going over this right now, but what I want to point out when we're thinking about the principle of supporting students in instruction is that's really what this part is meant to achieve, right? These academic language supports. In addition, in terms of coherence of the lesson, remember that what you have in terms of your academic language functions should be similar to or identical to your purpose. So right here, I have students will identify rhyming words and analyze spelling patterns. And up here, I actually didn't have the analyze spelling patterns. I could have put that here in my purpose. But I have that students will identify rhyming words that make up different word families. So that's part of where the coherence comes in. And then those are also coherent with the standards I've selected. So in terms of the supports and supports for instruction, you're going to see those in bold throughout my plan. I noticed that you guys organize your lessons pretty sensibly. You all had like a lesson introduction, and you all had a lesson closing, so that all sort of made sense. But I would like to see a little bit more thought and detail and focus go into your procedures. So I have a lot here in my procedures. And sometimes I even script out what I'm going to say. You don't have to script out what you're going to say, but sometimes I find it useful to think very carefully about how I'm going to introduce something to students. So you can take a second to read through the introduction and the modeling and the transition here, and then I'll talk about them. So I'll give you about, I don't know, a minute or so to read. So I'm going to go ahead. If you haven't finished reading through these procedures, feel free to go ahead and pause and then restart. So some of the things I want to point out are the focus. So in this lesson, I am really focusing on rhyme and rhyming words and word families, right? So in my after I read, I tell them that I noticed something. So this is where I'm telling them that I noticed a lot of rhyming words. And so I'm all that by doing that, I'm prompting them to think about rhyming words. All right. And I actually ask them to talk to students to see if they've already noticed some rhyming words. If this were a first lesson on rhyming, I would probably actually show them some of the words that I heard and saw that rhymed. But remember, the context of this lesson is that we've already been doing a lot with rhyming. So they should already be able to talk with one another about that. Um, and then I asked them to share what their partner said. As they offer examples, what I'm doing is I'm returning to the pages in the book where they appear. And that's really key because then they can see them in writing. We're going back into the text. Okay. And when I do that, I actually reread those pages and I point to those words and indicate the illustrations to support their understanding. Um, the other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start. I'm going to be asking them what they know about the words. And then as I'm writing these rhyming pairs on chart paper, I'm going to be categorizing them differently, right? With inconsistent ones separated into a different column or even on a different piece of chart paper. And then as we're talking about that, and as students are talking about what they notice, I'm going to be underlining or highlighting the spelling patterns and thinking aloud. Again, that's the modeling piece. I'm going to be thinking aloud about how some of them even share common vowel teams like EE, OU, right? Like mouse and house, or OE. And so I'm then going to introduce the concept of word families, writing it at the top of the paper. Note how all of this, in terms of being coherent, is consistent with the focus of my lesson. Just because I had this part in here that was meant to support students' understanding doesn't mean I'm teaching comprehension right now. But I want this to be meaningful to them. So I want to make sure that they're understanding things as I'm teaching, in particular the words that we're focusing on. I'm going to draw students' attention to inconsistent rhyming patterns. And I'm going to be reading to them as I point to them. I'm going to remind them that not all rhyming words share a spelling pattern, and that the more they read, the more they'll recognize what I like to call oddballs and how to spell them, right? Um, and I also remind them that they can invent spelling too as they write. But many times rhyming words do share spelling patterns. So I want my students to know that when they hear that, that's a tool they can use to figure out what a word in the text says, but also to think about how they might spell a word when they're writing. Okay. After that, so you can see all of the support that I've given them. You can see the focus of the lesson and how it's coherent across the lesson. You can also see that this is meaningful because my focus is not just knowing what a rhyme is, but getting them to think about how they can use rhyme in their own reading and writing for meaningful purposes. And then it's all contextualized within an engaging and meaningful read aloud. And I continue the focus, the coherence, and the engagement and meaningfulness and contextualization into their next activity. So this is just a mini lesson. So I've stopped this mini lesson after the transition. But basically, what they're going to be doing is they're going to be working in partners in supported practice, sharing a book, and they're going to read it out loud with one another. And then they're going to go back into the book and they're going to find as many rhyming words as they can. So they're going to be doing what I modeled in this earlier portion of the lesson. Okay. And they may find words that rhyme, that with ones we found in Mass Mess, but they might find others, and they can write them down in their sticky notes. What's going to happen is that after they're done with, so then I transition them into the activity, and then after they're done with that activity, I would bring them back together. So it would be like toward the end of the reader's workshop period, and we would then debrief and talk about the words they found and add them to the chart. Now, in terms of assessment, we also really need to think about what the purpose and focus of the lesson was, and we need to think about being coherent. So we don't want to start assessing things that we weren't teaching, right? So I have articulated here what I'm going to be doing sort of in the moment while I'm teaching. I'm going to be engaged in this concept of kid watching, which is just close observation, even while I'm teaching, to note students' level and quality of participation during the interactive read aloud, and then also how they're. I'll confer with partners as they're working and ask them to share what they have on their sticky notes. Let's say that I'm doing this and I notice that there's just mass confusion in the class. Sometimes what you need to do is actually take a time out in the middle of that activity and reteach a component from your mini lesson, right? Sometimes I may just notice particular students who could use additional explicit instruction and guided reading, and I can make a point to maybe bring those groups of kids together in guided reading groups the following day. And I would document what I'm observing in notes that I take. Ultimately, when I'm reading the writing that they produce independently, and when I'm reading with them, I would like to see them using rhyme to help them spell and to help them identify words. Ultimately, I'm going to be looking for some automatic word recognition, and I'm going to be looking for increasingly conventional spelling. And I'll document students' progress using observational checklists of spelling miscues, so I can be analyzing their writing for any patterns with which they are either spelling unconventionally or applying some of these rhymes. So that's what I would do for assessment, both during the instruction as well as in an ongoing fashion. Um, so I hope you got a chance to read over this lesson. Again, I'm going to be posting it on the wiki for you, so you'll be able to find it there. What I want to do now is I want to go back to the PowerPoint. So let me put this into slideshow again. Okay, oh, look at that. It went right back to the beginning. Let me move on here. So, so if we went back to these 5 principles that I want you employing in your lessons, you can see that my lesson was meaningful. The spelling patterns were taught based on words encountered in a text, and the lesson is designed to support students in meaningful reading and writing. The lesson is contextualized because I'm not just using random worksheets and lists of words, right? These spelling patterns are taught in the context of an authentic and engaging piece of literature and a read aloud activity, as well as partner reading with real books. Um, the lesson is focused. So again, I'm really focused on helping students identify rhyming words that make up different word families. And I want them identifying and analyzing these and ultimately using them to recognize words and use them in spelling. Um, and I said I listed 4 related reading foundational skills. Common Core standards, I think I only listed 3, but you get the point. It's clearly focused here. It's also supported. I did a lot of modeling, right, in this lesson. Um, and I've also got anchor charts and other academic language supports for students. And then finally, the instruction is coherent. So the purpose statement, the Common Core standards, the modeling and focused interactions, and the assessment procedures all align. I don't kind of go off the wall and start assessing their comprehension or their fluency or anything like that, right? So so yeah, so again, I really want you guys focusing on these components when you go about refining your current lesson plans, and also as you start planning additional lesson plans. So there they are again for you. And That's all I got. After you've watched this screencast, go and take a look at part 3 of this week's lesson, which just has some extension places that you could go. I'm going to have, lesson planning resources and websites and things like that up for you to take a look at.